So let's get started on the project. There are two things you need in order to make tight radius laminated wood sections. The first one is a jig. So, as they say, here's one I made earlier. Can be dead simple. Chunk of reasonably heavyweight plywood. This is 3/4 inch, that's ideal. And then some blocks simply screwed to it. What I've set up here is 2 blocks at 90 degrees. So that gives me a 90-degree bend. This piece in the middle, which is actually a scrap from when I was drilling a core out of another piece of wood, round is ideal. That one, make sure you get a nice even curve. If you're doing more than 12 inches, you might want 2 blocks in there, as many as you need to get a nice smooth curve. And these need to be pretty strongly attached because we're going to be clamping the wood to those. So if you see at the back, I've got 3 fairly hefty wood screws attaching to each of those blocks. So yeah, quick job to make out of scrap wood. Right, the other thing we need to make wood bend is heat. You may well have seen stuff on people bending thick chunks of wood. They have massive steam boxes, they're using pressurized steam, they've got huge frames with hydraulic means of bending it, all of that sort of stuff. And they'll also tell you that you have to use deciduous woods like oak and that you can't bend pine. That is true if you're bending thick sections. What we're doing is basically making up veneers. Those bend readily and you can use any wood you like. But to get them to bend properly, you need to get them hot. And steam is much more efficient at heating things up than air. So what you need is something like this. This is a cheap one I got from Viva. I actually bought it for cleaning the stove in the house, for which it's absolutely excellent. It also comes with adapters for things like stripping wallpaper. So you might have one. If not, they're pretty useful tools. This one cost me about $100. You can get cheaper ones. Anything that makes steam will do. You can't quite use a standard sort of electric kettle, but you can use any sort of water boiler. Basically anything that makes steam, and you don't need a lot of it. But we need to get the wood good and hot. So the other thing we need is a steam box. Again, people who do big jobs, you'll see massive constructions of heavy wood with steel liners and all sorts of stuff. We don't need that for this project. What we need is a lump of 4-inch drain pipe. That's all I'm using. And then all I do is stuff a rag in the end, and it works. If you just use a rag, it allows the steam to escape, but it traps enough steam in there to heat the wood. Right, so that's got the tools sorted. What we need now is some wood. What you use is going to depend on, you can use anything. There's lots of different sorts of wood. You want something which is reasonably durable and will give a reasonable finish. I'm using cedar, mainly because it's light, it's strong, and it's very durable. Most of the pines would be fine. If you've got access to some at a reasonable price, you can use a hardwood. What you need to do is to work out how thick your veneers need to be for the wood you're using. And the best way to do that is to experiment with a scrap of wood before you start. So we start off with super thin. This bit went a bit wrong when I was cutting it, so it's tapered. But that's actually quite useful. If I take that and try and bend it, you can see that will easily bend into a 90-degree bend on a tight radius without even warming it up. But this is only maybe about a 1/16 of an inch. You would need an awful lot of layers. You're going to finish up with more glue than wood. If we go to the other extreme, this is 3/8. And I can barely bend it. That would be fine if I wanted to make a beam to go across the whole of the boat, and I wanted a slight bend in it. That would be great. But for tight bends, even if I could get that hot enough, I haven't got the strength to bend it, and I don't have a big bending jig. So I want something in between. So what I found was that for this cedar, 1/8 inch works fine. This one's pre-bent because I was testing it to make sure it would bend, and you can see that will quite happily form a 12-inch radius bend. If I wanted to do that tighter bend on it without heating it, chances are it would crack. If this will bend to a 2-foot radius cold, it'll bend to a 1-foot radius hot. It makes that much difference. Okay, the other thing is, this is the bit of wood that I cut it from. What matters, the grade of the wood is not super important, but you must have sections which are knot free. If there's a knot in your veneer, it will break at the knot, guaranteed. The other thing is, you need the grain running straight down the length of the wood. If the grain runs across, like that, then the wood is going to crack when you try and bend it. It's got to be straight grain. That's the most important thing. If you can get a nice fine grain, that will give you a stronger laminate, but that's not as critical as the grain being straight, so that it doesn't crack. The other thing is, I did try an experiment using a wider piece, and the result is fairly obvious. It split. In theory, yeah, you could use something this wide. This is 4 inch. Makes it much more difficult to bend. You need a lot more power to bend it, and the chances of it cracking are much higher. It's much better to stick to fairly narrow sections. The other thing about the sections is that's plenty wide enough to make a strong arch. What counts is not the width, it's the depth. That's what gives you the rigidity and the strength. And I want a 2-inch deep section. 1.5 inches is plenty wide enough. Could probably get away with 1 inch, but it would look a bit skinny. Okay, so back to the jig. The last thing we need to know is how long a piece of wood do we need to cut. And the way to do that is to actually measure around your jig. So just get a tape measure. Doesn't need to be super accurate, and just get a reasonable measure. If I measure that, it comes out at 21 inches. I'm going to allow 22 as to give myself a bit of spare. I want enough to go, turn this round. So this is the bend I'm making, but I need these legs long enough to be able to attach the beam across the cockpit and the uprights. So I need at least that much. The other thing to remember is that might be 22, but by the time you get to the outside of a 2-inch beam, it's going to be a significantly longer radius. So I'm going to add an extra couple of inches to that, and I'm going to go up to 24 inches. It doesn't matter if it's a bit too long, this is all going to get trimmed down when we make the joints on the ends. So yeah, if you generate 1 inch to a scrap on the end, that's fine. If you make them too short, that's not fine. Okay, so let's get cutting. Okay, so now we need to cut our wood. How much do we need? If we're using 1/8 laminates, then that's 8 per inch. In theory, for a 2-inch beam, that's 16 laminates. But we need to allow for the glue as well, so 14 is going to do. So we need 14 1/8 thick pieces, 24 inches long. They need to be accurately cut. They've got to be even thickness. If your thickness isn't even, they won't bend evenly and you'll get gaps in your laminates, and that's potentially a weak spot. The only way that you're going to cut that accurately enough is with something like a table saw. You need a rigid blade, so something like a 10-inch blade that's solid is the only thing that's going to cut it accurately enough. Okay, if you can't cut the wood yourself, all is not lost. If you look at wood suppliers that are supplying timber for things like building canoes, they will often sell packs of veneer that are the right size and thickness for doing this sort of project. It's going to cost you more, but if you haven't got a table saw, that's probably going to be the best way to go. If you're just doing one arch, it's not going to be worth buying a job site saw, although these are incredibly useful for working on boats. Okay, so I'm going to cut all the pieces of timber, and then I will come back and show you how to bend them and then laminate them together. Right, so we're ready to steam the first batch. So I've got enough pieces cut to make a 2-inch piece. They're 2 feet long. The grain is nice and straight, as you can see, and I've cut out any odd bits that had knots in. So we've got steamer ready to go. That's all heated up. We've got a piece of plastic pipe. Can't be simpler. Stick your bits of wood in the plastic pipe. Put the end of the steamer in. Plug the ends with some rag. I'm just using shop towel. Okay, now the only other thing we need on this steamer is a means of clamping it on. So I'm just using a G-clamp to hold the switch. There we go. And as you can probably see, we're getting spare steam coming out of this end, which means it's going. So that's going to need about 20 minutes to steam, and then I'll come back and we can set up the first set of ends. Okay, so we've had the steamer on for half an hour. The wood should be nice and hot. You need to make sure you get everything ready for the next step, because these thin bits of wood, they cool down quickly, and you've got to get them bent before they cool. So make sure you've got everything laid out and ready to go. The first thing we need to do is move the steamer. So just stick that on the floor out of the way. I've got 3 decent sized G-clamps ready to clamp it up. I've got my jig ready. So yeah, okay, I didn't have a drain set up, so quite a good idea to arrange some means of catching the water that comes out of the steamer. Okay, so take the end out, slide all the wood out in one go, stick that on the floor. Ow, this is hot. Okay, so first thing you want to do is to get the centre clamp on. So line your wood up in the middle. and clamp the middle one. Yeah. Okay. Should have opened these clamps up first. Having said make sure everything's ready, I didn't. Okay, so okay, don't try and bend it too fast. A steady pressure will encourage it to bend. And then get the clamps wound up. Good idea to try and do this reasonably evenly rather than get one side fully clamped up before you start on the other side.
There were a couple of things that didn't work out terribly well on this first attempt. One is that I did need more support around the bend to make it even. I added an extra couple of blocks which helped, but I think it would also be a good idea to put something round the bend, so I'm going to make that as a modification to the jig for the next one. The other thing I found is that because the wood is very hot and soft, it did tend to dent from the clamps, so you need to put some blocks under the clamps to protect the wood. So anyway, I'm going to leave me clamping that up because it takes quite a long time and go on to the next bit.
Right, so that's had time to cool down. So let's take the clamps off and see how it's done. Right, so there is a lot of spring back. You can see it's partially bent. That's fine. We don't need it to keep it straight. Now we've got enough, it's bent enough that we can cold bend it when we glue it up. That's what we're looking for. So that will now bend around the jigsaw. Okay, so I've added a couple of extra blocks, as you can see, to give it more support. That will make sure that we get a more even round. Okay, now need to glue it up. The glue I'm using is this stuff called Type Bond 3. You can use any glue you like, but it's got to be a fully waterproof strong glue. something like this one, which gives you quite a reasonable open time. The other one that you can use is you can use the thickened epoxy. So what we need is a decent layer of glue on each side, on each piece. I nearly forgot. Before we start gluing up, if we just glue this up to the jig, the pieces are going to glue together, but they're also going to glue themselves to the jig. So I need to add something as a quick release. And what I'm going to use is just kitchen foil. Alternatively, you could use a sheet of plastic. You're going to need to cut it to fit somewhere near around the jig. So I'm just going to cut So I've just cut a rough half circle out, and then I can put this around my jig just to stop everything sticking to the jig. Right, now I can start assembling my bits of wood. First one in place. And again, I'm going to start clamping from the middle. Let's turn this around. It's going to be a lot easier to put the clamps on. Right, before you get it totally tightened up, make sure it's all pressed firmly down, and then tighten that one up until you see glue squeezing out. And then simply move it around. And because we've got these nicely pre-bent, I'm not going to need to use a lot of clamping pressure. Get that one started and then do the other side. Always make sure you're sort of clamping from the middle outwards reasonably evenly. You don't want to get one side completely clamped up before you start moving the other side. Right, so that is all glued up. Make sure that's tied down. Okay, so that's got everything glued up. Lots of clamps help. The other thing is that you need to make sure you leave this clamped up until the glue is thoroughly dry. With this glue, that's going to be a full 24 hours. If you take the clamps off like you would do with a normal wood glue, after a couple of hours, the joint will spring apart. take the foil off so we can see. And there we go. We have one curved laminated piece. And that is ridiculously stiff and strong. That is not going to move anywhere. What we need to do now is to clean the faces up, because however much you try, you're never going to get this dead level. There's always going to be a certain amount of ridging. The best way of doing that is going to be to use a sander. Right. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a 40 grit sanding disc to get it roughly to shape. Right, so that's got that rough down. Most of the marks are out. So I'm going to change to 100 grit to clean it down, make it look nice, and round some corners off. Right, so I need to finish the inside off without the power sander, with the sheet. I'm actually using an old disc sander, but you need to be able to get around the corner, and you can't do that with the power sander. Right, okay, so that's as much as I'm going to do for now. Obviously, it will need some final finishing, but at the moment we're making a component rather than the finished bit. So, that's our nice, strong, curved joint. As I say, you could jump on this, it ain't going to go anywhere. So what can we do with it? So, what we've created is called a knee. And these were traditionally used in lots of places on boats. They're still extremely useful. You could use this to support the main beam that supports the mast. You could use it to reinforce anything else on a cabin roof. You could use it that way to reinforce the cockpit floor. There's lots of different uses for it. What we're making here is a stern arch that will take something like radar, or mount solar panels, that sort of thing. But this video is already 20 odd minutes long, so I'm going to finish off making the stern arch in the second video, when I will create the uprights and the centre beam, show you how to joint those together. And one of the big advantages of using this system to make a stern arch is I can make those joints so they can be finished and screwed together when I get to the boat. If you're making a stern arch in the workshop, if you welded it all together out of stainless steel or finished everything off, how would you get that to the boat? In my case, that's a long drive and a ferry ride, because my boat is way down the coast. So a big advantage of this is I can effectively create a kit that I can finish off on the boat. So that will be part 2.